Okay, ecological succession is a series of predictable changes that occur in a community over time. This may take many years. If we're starting a new community, it could take hundreds of years. But it's predictable. It's always going to go in the same order. Okay? If an environment is trying to stay balanced, what's a word we know that we've talked about in the cell unit, we've talked about it in the body unit, we talked about it in genetics? It means balanced. Yes? Okay, that does mean balance, homeostasis, but it's also, the word starts with an E. Equilibrium. Good. Okay, there are two types of succession. There's primary succession, which is where essentially we're trying to create a new ecosystem. This occurs where there was no previous ecosystem there. A lot of places are like newly formed volcanic islands, areas where rock uncovered by a melting sheet of ice, places like that. This is not super common in the world today, but there are places that are melting, like the polar ice caps are melting. So then when we get past all the ice and we start at the rock, primary succession will start occurring. Okay. The second type of succession is secondary succession. And what this is where there was some sort of disturbance that happened, like a fire, hurricane, flood, over-farming, something like that. And now it's trying to rebuild the ecosystem back to what it was or to adapt to something new. Okay? Right now, we are living in an ecosystem where it is in ecological succession because this is not what Frisco looked like 10 years ago. Okay? And we're gonna look outside here in a minute when we're looking through the stages of ecological succession and decide which stage we're in. Okay? Because we are not a brand new community, right? It's not something that was rural. Well, it was rural, but it's not new. We're not starting from rock. So which succession are we going to be talking about? Primary or secondary? Secondary. Okay? So, primary succession. This takes significantly longer than secondary succession because we're starting out with a bunch of rocks and then we're trying to go to an ecosystem. So it does take a little while. This can take hundreds of years. It can take, because we're starting with rocks. It really depends on what environment you're starting in. Are you starting in a cool, warm, humid environment, or are you starting in essentially a grassland environment? Okay. The first species to populate in a new area is called a pioneer species. Okay. Pioneer species are usually like lichen. Repeat after me. Lichen. It's spelled lichen, but it's pronounced lichen. Or mosses. These are carried to soil by wind, and when we look at them, we typically think, oh, it's a plant that's growing on a rock. Well, it's actually not. It's growing from a crevice of a rock where there's actually very little soil, but there is some soil in it. Okay? So here's a picture. There's a picture of lichen on the left. Okay? And it can grow from hardened lava. It takes very little soil, very little moisture to start a lichen or a moss growth. Okay? So, soil formation starts by weathering, breaking down rocks, and then decaying plants that add the organic material. Now, sometimes it takes a while to get decaying plants because if all you got is rock and weathering, it takes you a while to grow a plant, so therefore you can have a dead plant. Okay, so as you can probably guess, you're like, okay, I can see why this takes a while. Okay, so here we're going to do the plants first. So we're going to talk through the primary succession timeline. First, we're going to start with the pioneer species. These are lichens and mosses. We've talked about that. Then we go to weeds and grass. So we're getting a little bit taller at each stage. If you're going to notice, the plant is going to get a little bit taller. Okay, so then we're to weeds and grasses. Then we move on to shrubs, annuals, and perennials. These are like grasses, roses, some sort of weed flowers, things like that. Then we move on to early trees. Okay, early trees means trees that are not huge. They're starting to grow. They're not giant trees. Remember when I showed you the picture of my house at the trees in the front yard? Well, these are not the type of trees. Those are considered late trees. Okay, so let's look out our window. What type of trees do we have? Early or late? Early. We have early trees outside. Okay, so then we're going to move on to animals. We're going to start off, there aren't going to be any animals. Okay, we're going to start off with none. Then we're going to move to small herbivores, insects, rodents, birds. Okay, these are going to be things that can eat just the weeds and the grasses. Then we're going to move into larger herbivores like rabbits and small carnivores like foxes. Okay, you have to have a place for these to live in, so it makes sense that if we have shrubs now, that these now have a place to live. Then we go to large herbivores and carnivores like deer, elk, and wolves once we get trees. Okay, now you're probably not going to get the big old elk and stuff if you don't have any late trees at all, but you might. Okay, so. Okay, so then once we get to a climax community, this is a stable last stage of ecological succession in which plants and animals can stay in a state of equilibrium, meaning that they can live and harmonize together. The end of succession is when everything stops changing suddenly. Okay? Succession can happen very quickly once it gets to the shrub phase. Okay, that happens significantly faster, but it takes time for those trees to grow, right? Shrubs to grow. So, the steps for primary ecological succession start with new land exposed. Oops, sorry. New land exposed. Primary species, intermediate, and then climax community. Okay. The big one to remember is that this land exposed. Okay. That's how the big difference between primary and secondary. Okay. Secondary succession occurs when a disturbance happens. This is overflooding, overfarming, something that happens. It was already an ecosystem. Something came in and disrupted it. Okay, a disturbance. Okay, secondary succession is where what it does is it helps an ecosystem get back to balance. So we're out of balance now. Now we need to go back. This happens much faster than a primary succession, just because there's already some of the elements that you need there. There's already soil. There's already water sources and things like that. Okay, so this big one to remember is going to be, it starts with a disturbance, primary species, intermediate, climax. Okay, that's really big. Remember, those last three are the same, but the start of it is what changes. Okay, now if I was to give you a picture of a burnt forest, would that be primary or secondary succession? Yes, Luis. Secondary, because of why? Okay, because there already was a forest there. Good. Okay, so here's a picture of a disturbance. Okay, I could have given you a flood. I could have also put up over farming, things like that. Here's a primary species. That's not a very good picture, but if you're looking on my iPad, it's actually better because what you can see down at the bottom is you can see the green starting down. You have to look past the dead trees, and down at the bottom there is green moss and lichen starting to grow. Okay, that's a primary species. Then here's an intermediate stage. This is kind of between those two stages. It is a early intermediate stage, and then here's a later intermediate stage where you can start to see the plants are starting to grow taller. And then finally, here's a back to climax community. Okay. Now, does this look exactly like it did before? No, because it's not going to be the same, but it's going to try and get back to balanced as quickly as possible. Okay, so here's a picture. Notice as we go, the big thing that I would love for you to see and remember is that everything goes in this kind of trajectory. Okay, I know I just cut off one of the trees, but for the most part, it's going up